How does a bill get passed in the EU? First, the Commission starts the bill, taking into account the recommendations from the European Parliament, the civil society, and the Member States. If the Council of Ministers and the European Parliament then vote in favor of the law proposal, the law has to be implemented in each EU member state. But how have these three institutions been elected, and who are the people who sit in the European Parliament, the Council of Ministers, and the Commission? The politicians in the European Parliament were elected in the election to the European Parliament, which is held every 5 years. Brits can vote for the British candidates, Poles can vote for the Polish candidates, and so forth. The highest number of seats a country can have in the European Parliament is 96, which Germany has. And the lowest number of seats a country can have in the European Parliament is 6, which Estonia, Cyprus, Luxembourg, and Malta have. So altogether, big countries like Germany have more to say in the EU than small countries. However, small countries like Malta have more representatives per capita than big countries. The number of seats a country has in the European Parliament changes every election depending on the percentage of the total population the country makes up. The European Parliament uses plurality voting, which means in order to get a bill passed, at least 50% of the votes cast have to be in favor of the bill. The European Parliament's primary job is to represent the people's opinions. The Council of Ministers consists of all the ministers from the EU countries who were elected in their own national elections. So when there's a question about finance in the Council, the finance ministers of each country will be sent to the Council. The ministers don't have their own election. They're elected after, for example, the British general election or the German Bundestag election. After that, the elected politicians decide themselves who will become ministers. The ministers can vote using three methods: plurality voting, qualified majority, and unanimity. The three different voting methods are used depending on the kind of bill the Council is voting on. The reason why the European Parliament shouldn't just solely vote on bills like in the most EU countries is that the country's governments also have to show their standpoint on the issues. Lastly, there's the Commission. The Commission consists of 27 commissioners and the Commission President, one from each country. They are elected indirectly by the people. That is, there is no election where the EU citizens actually go and cast their vote for the commissioners. First, the EU Council, which consists of the EU countries' heads of state, choose a presidential candidate, who then has to be approved by the European Parliament in order to become president of the European Commission. But after the Lisbon Treaty in 2009 got signed, it was decided that the EU Council had to take the results of the election to the European Parliament into account when electing the new Commission president. There was some discussion about how this in practical terms should be done, but in the 2014 election it was decided that every party in the European Parliament could decide a candidate who they wanted to become president of the European Commission. In the European Parliament, they then later voted for the candidate they wanted to become president. It was called the Spitzenkandidaten process, or the lead candidate process. That also of course means that the largest party in the European Parliament has the biggest chance of having their candidate become president of the European Commission. As the European Parliament has voted, the EU Council then formally elects the candidate that received the most votes in the European Parliament. In 2014, Jean-Claude Juncker was elected president. The Commission President and EU countries' parliaments will then elect 27 commissioners that each receive their field of responsibility. That is, one commissioner from each country except the country where the Commission President is from. The Commission then has to be approved as a whole by the European Parliament, and then the European Commission is formed. It has to be noted though that the Commission President doesn't have a lot to say when the commissioners are being elected. For the most part, it's the governments that choose the set of people that the Commission President then alongside with the governments get to elect the commissioner from. The Commission's job is to deal with the EU's joint interests.